Hello, welcome to step 4 of part 3 in a 3-part tutorial series on how to write a philosophy essay. Part 3 is dedicated to a detailed step-by-step guide to writing a philosophy essay and is more technical than parts 1 and 2. Each of the lessons in part 3 covers one of the steps of the guide. While you can watch the lessons independently from one another, or in any order you wish to watch them, each assumes that you have either watched the previous ones or have sufficient knowledge of the area they cover. In step 1, we began with how to read a philosophy text. I explained what we are looking for when we read an assigned philosophy text, and that was an argument. We focused on finding arguments in a text. We saw the importance of paraphrasing for separating arguments from the rest of the text. I showed you how an argument can be broken into its premises and a conclusion or thesis, and what the difference between a deductive and inductive argument is. In step 2, we looked at a way of evaluating those arguments you identified through the key concepts of soundness of an argument, validity, and truth. And in a previous lesson, step 3, we made a plan for your essay according to a commonly used form of a philosophy essay, what I call an argument outline plan. By now, you should be convinced that reading, evaluating what you have read, and making a plan is half or more than half of the task of writing a philosophy essay. So actually writing the essay itself is often less than half the work. And those of you who watched the very first part of this tutorial might remember that I somewhat jokingly told you that the single most important tip for writing a philosophy essay is to not procrastinate. There's lots of work involved in writing an essay. So yes, this time we're ready to begin writing. And let's begin with an outline of the essay. An outline of an essay is different from its plan. The outline is the essay's shape, while the plan is its substance, as you will soon see. Here is an outline for a philosophy essay. As with most essays, a philosophy essay has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. We will start with the introduction because it is the first section of an essay, even though sometimes it's the last thing you write. However, if you followed the previous video on planning your essay, it will be the first thing you write. A basic introduction has 3 parts: the thesis statement, the plan of the essay, and the background information. A formal introduction has the first 2. For the same topic we examined in the previous video, this is what a formal introduction might look like. In this essay, I will argue that philosopher A fails to establish that we do in fact have free will. First, I will outline A's argument, then I will show how A's third premise is unsupported, and finally I will conclude that A's argument fails. The first sentence is your thesis statement. So those of you who saw the first video of part 3 will recall the difference between your thesis statement and the thesis statement of the philosopher or position which you identified when you read the text. The philosopher A's thesis was that we have free will. In your thesis statement, you are stating that you disagree with philosopher A's thesis that we have free will. The second sentence tells your reader how you are going to make your point. The second sentence also happens to be a very short summary in prose form of the plan we made in the previous video, step 3 of part 3. If you have found the claim, argument, or thesis to be unsound, then you will see the argument as failing and you will be disagreeing with it. In this specific example, which I made in order to give an example of the shortest kind of essay, there's no philosopher B or position B. There is only one philosopher's position, and you are the one disagreeing with that. To repeat, this is the example of the simplest critical essay. In other cases, you are expected to find reasons to agree with a claim as well as to disagree with it, in order to show why your reasons for disagreeing are stronger than reasons for agreeing. Back to our outline. Let us take another look at the introduction part of your essay. A formal introduction isn't essential unless it's specifically requested. The main beneficiary of writing such an introduction is yourself. If you write those two elements down, they will help you keep track of your plan as you write the essay. Especially in lower year philosophy papers, graders generally prefer to see both of those because it gives them an idea what to look for in your essay. But there are times when your paper, even after your best efforts at editing, is over the word count. In which case you might have to delete most of your introduction. What is essential, however, what you don't want to throw away in an introduction is your thesis statement. The thesis statement is not only a guide for your readers, but much more important, it is a leash that directs you, that keeps you on course. Why? Because once you've stated what your thesis is, you are committed to it. Every paragraph, every sentence you write has to be guided by your thesis statement. For every sentence you write, you have to ask yourself, how does this sentence help me towards showing my thesis to be true or probably true? But caution, this does not mean that every sentence you write should support your thesis. As I shall emphasize again later, the better you can challenge your own thesis and then defend yourself against those strong challenges, the more likely that your thesis will be convincing. Another pointer before we return to our outline. If, after writing your draft, you find that your position isn't as strong as you thought it would be, then change your thesis statement to a less ambitious one and revise your paper accordingly. I can assure you that ambitious theses are hard to prove, and with less ambitious ones you can write an excellent essay. In any case, when you rewrite your thesis statement, you won't have to start from zero, because you would have already broken down the thesis of philosopher A or position A into its premises. You have also already evaluated it for validity and soundness. You will be able to use all or most of that evaluation. The introduction may also involve background information, but is not always essential for two reasons. First, some arguments are thorough and clear enough not to require background information. Second, sometimes it's necessary to reveal the background information during the essay and not in the introduction. When you do include background, it has to be background that helps your reader understand your essay, such as the following. What does your thesis mean? What are the meanings of the key concepts in your essay? If your thesis is true, does it change the way we understand the subject matter the thesis is about? Does it affect other related questions in philosophy? Again, if your thesis is true, does it mean that we have to take a new look at other related issues, even real world, social, political, or scientific issues? So, in a critical philosophy essay, background information is not historical or biographical information about the philosopher whose ideas you're analyzing. Neither is background information meant to be a reproduction of the text you're writing about. Please don't write, Philosopher A starts her article by citing so and so. Then she says this other thing. In her next paragraph, she goes on to say this and that. Once you start stating step by step what is written in your assigned text, you get into the storytelling mode and you forget to stick to the argument. You waste precious space with irrelevant details. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to ignore the order the author is written in. There's a place and time for that sort of explication, but that's not the majority of undergraduate philosophy essays, unless the professor has specifically asked for it. Now let's look at the body of the essay. What do you think the body of the paper will look like? You guessed it. The body is identical to the plan of the essay. Now you will write it in prose form in the order of the plan, making sure that the claims, disagreement with the claims, and reasons for each are written and explained clearly. In its most fleshed out version, that plan looked like this. Some of you might have not liked this form, so I'm going to present it in slightly different terms that you might be more familiar with. I kept the alternate form for this video and didn't give it in the previous video, which was about planning. Because I did not want to overburden you while watching the previous video, which was the most technical in the series, even though the alternative should go in that section for consistency. No harm done though, because this will be a timely repeat of essay planning. But before I move on to that, I have to bring up one of the most difficult areas for some students, even those who are not beginners. Citations. So, what do you do immediately after you write someone, such as Anna or Brad, said or wrote something? Every time you write that philosopher A or philosopher B states anything, whether it's a claim, a description, a story, or a reference to some other philosopher's words, immediately write next to it the source and page number where she or he states it. Do not put this off for later. Unless the assigned rating is just a couple of pages, it will take more time trying to find a page number later. Unless you're using a searchable online text, but even then, it will be unnecessary extra work. I shall say no more about citations and referencing, not because it's not important, but because it's so important that it needs a discussion of its own. And that discussion is not specific to philosophy. Citation is important, but not difficult to learn. There are many resources to help you on this topic. Once you understand the essence of citing, you will find it very easy, and some of you already have no difficulty with it. It seems to me that students find citing difficult because they assume it is difficult. Let's return to where we left off. If you're looking for an alternative to this outline of an argument that I've been using throughout this tutorial series, or this form, which is the same, but in this instance applied to a standard question in philosophy on free will. I will present it in slightly different terms in a moment with some additional notes. But if you're happy with this form, then you can fast forward to the part that is about the conclusion of the essay. Otherwise, If you're curious or confused, stay with me for a couple more minutes. I chose this basic form as consisting of a repeatable pattern of thesis and objection to thesis, because some of you might find it easier to remember. Usually, the longer the essay, the more this pattern will be repeated. Some very short essays might consist of just the thesis and objection to it, or objections to it. If both the thesis and objection are in your assigned reading, then this is an exegetical essay. If only the thesis is in your assigned reading, and you have to provide the objection, then this will be a critical essay. Here we see two iterations of the basic pattern of thesis and objection. If your reading contained both thesis and objection to it, in order to write a critical essay, depending on whether you agree or not with the original thesis, you will have to use at least one more iteration, or a partial iteration like this. Let me explain the rationale behind it. The first stage is stating the argument for the thesis. This won't be your thesis, but a previously stated thesis in the work you're assigned to read about, unless you're writing original work, such as stating a thesis based on a passage from an assigned novel. So normally, your thesis in a standard critical undergraduate paper is that you agree or disagree with the original thesis. We are going to assume that you have been given a reading with only a thesis and no objections. You will need to adjust this form according to your needs if you are also provided with objections or if you're provided with more than one reading. After the thesis comes the objections, which involves trying to build a case against the thesis. It does not matter whether you agree or disagree with the thesis. Follow the original thesis with an objection or objections to it. The objection should be based on the argument evaluation methods we went over in step 2. That would be 2 videos earlier. And so I'm going to give you an extra recap here. You ask, are both the stated premises and the implied or assumed premises true? Is the structure of the argument valid? So, in order to object, you must find either a false premise or premises, or an invalid form of argument for deductive arguments, and a weak form of argument for inductive arguments. To repeat again, you will not often have to carry out these evaluations alone and pull objections out of thin air. Many objections will already have been discussed in class or in tutorials. It is very important that objections are based on correct representation of the original thesis or its premises. Otherwise, you can be in danger of introducing what is called a straw man fallacy, which I also like to call a styrofoam argument. A straw man is a logical fallacy and is not acceptable. To commit this fallacy is to exaggerate the opponent's position so that it becomes easy to object to. Here's an example. Imagine you were objecting to an evolutionist, and this was part of your argument against evolutionism. According to the evolutionist, a dog can give birth to a cat. If this was the position of an evolutionist, it would be easy to argue against her, just like it is easy to bend straw or bake styrofoam with hardly any effort. But this is not the position of an evolutionist. Instead of giving the thesis you are arguing against, including each of its premises, the best possible interpretation before you object to it, You are giving it a made up, a weak interpretation. As a result, any objection you come up with based on that interpretation is not an objection to the evolutionist thesis, but an imaginary thesis based on false premises you invented. Not only does your objection not count as a legitimate objection, your having used it counts against you. When you feel threatened by an idea you don't agree with, you might subconsciously want to make that idea sound ridiculous just so you can argue against it. Watch out for that. As for doing it deliberately, well, that is intellectual dishonesty, and let's not even go there. You have to be careful not to use a strawman fallacy in the opposite direction as well. Don't make your objection so weak so that you can come back easily and knock over the objection and agree with the original thesis. It is very important that objections should be as critical as you can make it. The straw man fallacy is one of dozens of logical fallacies that you must avoid when writing a philosophy essay, or any essay. Logical fallacies are often based on bad habits of thinking. In step 1 of part 3 of this series, that would be video number 4, I also talked about another logical fallacy, begging the question, otherwise known as circular reasoning. Logical fallacies are likely to be covered in your philosophy course, and there are excellent online tutorials on them. Back to our outline. Once the objections are complete, you have to return the microphone to the defender of the original thesis. In many readings, the philosopher would have done this himself, but remember that we're assuming that your assignment only provides the original thesis. So you have to now defend the original thesis. In other words, at this point, it's your responsibility to defend the thesis as best as you can against the objections you just made, as if you were the original philosopher yourself, even if you disagree with the thesis. If you agree with the thesis, you should try to provide further reasons for agreeing with the thesis, ones not provided by the philosopher himself. You must leave the thesis in better condition than you found it. And if you agree with the thesis, that would conclude the body of your essay. But if you disagree with it, then you have to raise further objections. And because you have already given the thesis the best defense possible in the name of the author, these further objections will have credibility. And if you disagree with the thesis, that will be the end of the body of your essay. Let's pause here. I want to cover as many assignment types as possible, but I also don't want to lose you in too much detail. Otherwise, depending on how much work has already been done in the article or topic assigned to you and what your assignment is, or in scholarly work, these iterations of the basic pattern might continue. But we can reasonably stop here for our purposes. So to recap, the body of your paper could consist of just this, or this, or this. And as a beginner, you might be relieved to find out that often you will be asked only to provide one or two objections to the thesis, and not every imaginable one. Even seasoned philosophers do not need to provide all possible objections. Look, I know that for some of you this is too much information to take in all at once. But in the last dozen slides, I did not introduce anything new. I just presented what I gave earlier in a different form that some of you I thought might find more appealing. Not all students have the same learning style. So for some of you, none of these argument outlines are conducive to learning how to analyze a philosophy paper and then write about your analysis. But I can assure you that you will find another way that works for you, either from practice or from a philosophy writing help clinic or your tutor or other videos and books. So continue searching. Please write down any helpful resources you found in the comments section so that other students can benefit. We just went through a partial repeat of what was covered in the previous video. That was good for students who decided not to watch that video, and also for students who are looking for an alternative. This review also helped us stress three important lessons. 1. Do not misrepresent a position you disagree with by making it weaker. If you do, you will be committing a logical fallacy. Disagreeing with a claim made of straw does not represent sophistication. 2. This is the other side of the same coin. If you cannot think of a good objection, do not make up silly or weak ones. If you are not convinced, no one else will be convinced. 3. If you cannot come up with a good objection, then perhaps you need to abandon your original position and change your thesis. Of course, that's not a loss, it's a discovery on your part. You will now have a better view of the matter. And here I state number 1 again, in a different context. Do not state your conclusion unless you've given the position you argue against the best hearing possible. Before objecting to it, defend it with the same rigor you would defend your own position. Only then will it have argumentative value. So far, we've looked at the introduction and body of the essay. Now for the conclusion. A very short essay may not have a conclusion. Otherwise, the conclusion is sometimes a summary of your argument and reiteration of how you went about it, and sometimes a call to future action. Here is a formal conclusion, very much like the formal introduction. Notice that the only difference is now it's in the past tense. An important rule about conclusions that students tend to forget is never introduce new arguments in the conclusion. Such a move will give your essay a confused look and reduce its overall credibility. If you think that your additional point is important, you may mention it as a future action. I will not give an example of that here because the phrasing of future action is critical and requires too much detail for me to get into here. Also, even future action elements need to be hinted at in the body of the work. Your professor or tutor should be able to help you with that. And as you read more and more philosophy articles and books, you will learn from their example. We've now completed the first 4 steps of writing a philosophy essay, finishing with the step of writing a draft consisting of 3 parts, based on an outline that looks like this, or this, or this, or this. And even this, as many essays do not require background information. Some of you might be surprised to find that the that we will cover in the next lesson is just as important as the previous one, and is in fact considered the most important step in writing by all writers. Check out the next video if you want to find out why.